By the time I understood what was happening, the room had already gone too quiet. Not silent, never silent in that building. The wind kept forcing itself through the window seals with that thin, needling hiss, and somewhere below us the Atlantic kept hitting the rock face under the cliff in slow, heavy blows you could feel in your teeth. The floor thrummed with it. The air smelled like disinfectant cut with salt water, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. But the patient under my hands wasn't making any sound at all. He was strapped to the bed at wrists and ankles, chest band fastened tight enough to stop the worst of the thrashing. Or that was what I'd told myself less than a minute earlier. His face had gone slack. His mouth hung open. I kept waiting for the next rise of his chest, and it just didn't come. And then the intercom above the door crackled. Nobody had touched the panel at the station. I knew that. Judith was down the hall. I was alone in room 7. The speaker gave one dry burst of static. Then a calm man's voice said very clearly, "You're holding him too long again." I froze. The leather restraint at the patient's chest creaked under my hand. Tightening. Not by much. Just enough for me to feel it pull against my palm as if someone on the other side of the mattress had taken hold and tugged. Then the patient opened his eyes. They were already on me as if he'd been awake the whole time. His lips barely moved. "You didn't learn," he whispered. And what I still can't explain, not cleanly, not in a way that lets me sleep, is why the voice coming out of that stranger's mouth belonged to Oliver Dane Kitteridge, and when Oliver had been dead for 5 years. It started 6 hours earlier, with the wind. When I pulled into the staff lot at Gull Harbor, the sky was still that flat iron color Maine gets before a real coastal storm, the kind that makes the sea look less like water and more like a sheet of dark metal trying to lift itself into the air. I could hear the surf before I killed the engine. Not the pleasant kind of ocean sound people imagine when they talk about the coast. This was a deep, repetitive thud, wave after wave battering the cliffs below the unit until the building itself seemed to answer. Gull Harbor sat right at the edge of that drop, half treatment center, half overnight residence, all poured concrete and reinforced glass. From the road it looked less like a hospital than a military outpost somebody had left behind. Narrow windows, in-squat wings. Service entrance built low against the wind. It had an intake ward on the east side and long-term rooms on the west, with the central nurses' station boxed in between them like a bunker. I hadn't worked nights there in years. That was what I told myself as I stepped out into the cold, as if years mattered, as if a building forgot. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not outside, inside the second the outer door sealed behind me. Disinfectant, floor cleaner, old laundry heat, and under it that persistent saline tang that never left the place because the wind always found a way in. Every hospital has its own smell. Gull Harbor's had always reminded me of somebody trying to sterilize the ocean and failing. My shoes squeaked on the waxed corridor. A monitor chirped somewhere beyond the locked ward door. A patient laughed once too hard, then stopped abruptly. I signed in, clipped on my badge, and tried not to look at the restraint cabinet against the wall beside the station. Judith Claire Fenwick came out of the medication room carrying a clipboard and a mug that smelled like burnt coffee. She was in her late 60s by then, all clean lines and soft gray hair pinned back hard from her face, the sort of woman who could make an entire room lower its voice by walking into it. She'd been senior night nurse at Gull Harbor longer than anybody could remember. Some of the younger staff called her Jude when she wasn't around. Nobody did it to her face. "Amen," she said, as if she'd seen me yesterday instead of almost 3 years earlier. "Storm coverage. Looks like it. It'll peak at 2:13. She said that without checking anything. In no weather app, no wall clock. just a fact delivered in the same tone she'd have used to tell me a patient's blood pressure. I hung my coat and took the clipboard. "You've got the forecast down to the minute now?" "I've got tonight down to the minute." There was no smile on her face when she said it. That should have been enough. Looking back, that was the moment I should have left. But night nursing trains you to normalize almost anything if it's delivered in the right tone. People panic, patients escalate, staff get strange on doubles, and the only way the work gets done is by deciding most things can be explained later. Judith sounded composed. The unit was fully staffed, at least on paper. I was there for one night, storm coverage and observation support. I told myself she was being dramatic because the weather had everyone on edge. She handed me the clipboard, then opened the middle drawer of the station desk and slid a folded sheet of paper toward me. It was laminated, edges worn soft from handling. "Read those before you do anything else," she said. I looked at the sheet, then at her. New protocols? Not new. Temporary storm procedures? No. The wind pressed against the windows with a low whistle. Somewhere in the west wing, a call bell chimed twice, then cut off. Judith didn't even turn her head. "You follow them exactly tonight," she said. "Not almost. Not the way you think they ought to read, exactly." There was something in the way she said that last word that made me look at her properly. Her face was calm. Too calm. Not strained, not frightened. Settled, as if she'd already made peace with how the night would go. I took the sheet. She added, "And if the intercom speaks when no one has activated it, do what it says." I let out a short laugh before I could stop myself. "You're serious?" "Completely." That was when I noticed she hadn't once glanced at the clock above the medication room door. Not once. The paper felt slick in my hand, old laminate cleaned 1,000 times. There was a faint brown water stain at one corner trapped beneath the plastic. I knew that stain. I didn't know why I knew it, not yet. But my fingers went cold around the page all the same. Judith moved past me toward the locked chart room, her shoes making no sound on the floor. "Read," she said again, "then come find me." I stood alone at the station with the building breathing around me, the wind hissing at the windows, and unfolded the rules. The print was plain office black, probably done on the station copier years earlier. No logo, no date, no signature line. Just 6 lines, each one blunt enough to feel like an insult. If a patient asks to be restrained, do not comply. If the intercom speaks without being activated, follow its instructions exactly. Never enter room 7 after 2:13 in the morning. If you hear a patient speaking in a voice that is not theirs, respond as if it is. Do not remove restraints once applied, regardless of patient distress. If a patient stops breathing, wait for confirmation before intervening. I read the last line twice, then a third time. Every nurse has a handful of statements that bypass thought and hit the body first. Mine was that one. I felt my shoulders lock before my mind even put words to why. The speaker above the station let out a tiny electronic click. Not activation, not quite static, and I found myself looking up at it with the sheet still in my hand. Wait for confirmation before intervening. There wasn't a world in which that aligned with medical training, ethics, common sense, or basic human decency. Respiratory distress wasn't a philosophical question. You assessed. You intervened. You called a code if you had to. You didn't stand there waiting for some unspecified permission while a patient turned blue. I heard Judith returning before I saw her. Mug set down. Papers shifted. That soft, dry sound of nitrile gloves being snapped once at the wrist. I held up the sheet. "This one is insane." She didn't ask which line I meant. "Yes," she said. "You want me to ignore apnea until somebody signs off on it?" "I want you to do exactly what it says." "From who, Judith?" "To confirmation from who?" That was when she looked at me with an expression I still can't quite name. Not pity, not contempt, something older and more tired than either. "You'll understand by the end of the night." I hated that answer on instinct. Supervisors used it when they didn't want to explain something messy, and experience had taught me that messy usually meant political, not supernatural. Budget decisions, staffing corners cut, a physician with bad habits everyone quietly worked around. I latched onto that because it was the only version that left the world intact. I set the rules on the desk harder than I needed to. If this is some legal dodge, I'm not playing along. It isn't. Then what is it? The only reason anyone is alive in this building. I almost laughed again, but something in her face stopped me. The West Wing door buzzed. One of the overnight residents, a thin man with nicotine-yellow fingers and a tremor that never fully rested, stood just inside the observation window staring toward the station. His hospital socks whispered against the tile. He lifted one hand and tapped the glass twice with a fingernail. Judith didn't turn. "Go settle Mr. Bell in the day room," she said. "And Eamon." I looked back at her. Try not to improvise. That word sat badly with me. Improvisation was what night staff did. Weather outage, aggressive intake, missing order, physician unreachable. You worked with what you had. You kept people breathing until morning. The alternative was paralysis. Still, I folded the sheet and slipped it into my scrub pocket. The paper seemed warmer there than it should have been. "Mister?" Bell met me at the day room threshold with that same fixed stare. The television was off. The windows along the cliffside had metal storm shutters pulled halfway down, and every gust made them shiver in their tracks. The room smelled of stale coffee, hand soap, and the wet wool blanket somebody had left draped over a chair. "Evening," I said. He looked at my chest, not my face, at my badge, at the place where the rule sheet rested in my pocket. "They gave you the list," he said. His voice was his own, thin, reedy, nervous. "They gave me a list." He nodded once, lips pressed tight. "Don't let anybody ask you twice." "Ask me what?" But he'd already turned away, lowering himself into a chair by the window with extreme care, as if the floor might shift under him if he moved too quickly. I should have pressed. I know that now. And instead, I did what nurses do when the start of a shift feels wrong. I went procedural. Census check, med cart count, oxygen tank levels, crash cart seal intact, restraint keys in place, backup generator status. The ordinary rhythm of tasks did what it always does. It gave my hands something useful and my mind something smaller than dread to live inside. By 11 o'clock, the building felt almost normal. Almost. The storm still hadn't broken fully, but the pressure had changed. You could feel it in the ears. The hall lights seemed a shade dimmer, though that may have been imagination. The windows made a soft ticking sound from the wind-driven grit striking the outer glass. Patients were quieter than a unit that full ought to have been. Too many doors closed, too many call bells silenced at the first ring. At 11:20, while I was checking an observation note at the end of the east corridor, the intercom over the hall door clicked on. Nothing came through, just the click. Then the faint hum of an open line, then silence again. I stood there listening to my own breathing and the far-off thud of the sea. After a moment, I told myself the system was old. That was the second mistake. The first real break in the night came from observation 3. I heard the voice before I reached the door. Calm, male. Not loud, just clear enough to carry down the hall between the wind gusts and the floor vibration. The room smelled hot and close when I stepped in. Stale sweat under disinfectant, radiator heat drying everything into a faint mineral taste on the air. The patient on the bed was one of our short-stay admits, A broad-shouldered man in his 30s with bruised knuckles and a history of violent panic episodes. He'd spent most of the night so far pacing, muttering, asking for cigarettes we couldn't give him. When I checked him an hour earlier, he'd been agitated and unfocused, speech slurred by exhaustion. Now he sat perfectly still with both feet on the floor and his hands resting on his knees. He looked up when I entered, and in a voice that didn't belong to him, he said, "You had the flashlight between your teeth because the backup failed." Every muscle in my body clenched at once. The man's lips were moving. I saw that. But the voice was younger than his, steadier, with the soft down-east edges I'd heard 100 times in the old intake ward. Oliver's voice. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't, and the room seemed to narrow around the sound of it. The patient watched me with an expression that wasn't quite his either, not aggression, not confusion. Recognition. "The storm had taken the monitors," the voice said. "You said if I kept fighting, you'd have to document another team restraint, and nobody wanted that at 1 in the morning." My mouth had gone dry. "Who are you?" The patient's head tipped slightly, almost amused. That was wrong enough on its own, but then I remembered Rule 4. If you hear a patient speaking in a voice that is not theirs, respond as if it is. I heard myself say it before I consciously chose to. "Oliver." The patient smiled. Not wide, just enough. "I wondered how long it'd take you. There are memories you don't revisit because they hurt. And there are memories you don't revisit because they destabilize the whole scaffolding you keep around yourself." Oliver lived in the second category. I had a version of that night I allowed myself to remember. Storm, intake overflow, patient escalation, power interruption, bad outcome, tragic but chaotic. Nobody's fault in any provable way. The voice in Observation 3 stepped right through that story like it was tissue paper. "You crossed my wrists too high," it said. "Not because you thought it was safer, because it was faster." My skin prickled. I took one step toward the bed. The patient didn't react. "You told me to stop performing," the voice went on. "Do you remember that, Eamon? You said, 'Stop performing, Oliver, and lay still for once.'" I could smell the past then, not memory in any abstract sense, actual details. Wet canvas from a storm slicker hung too close to a heater. The bitter tang of the latex gloves we used to stock in intake. Rainwater tracked across linoleum. The hot copper taste of the flashlight battery cap against my molars. No one could have known those things, no one. The intercom above the door crackled to life so suddenly that both of us looked up. A burst of static. Then Judith's voice, flat and official. "Restrain the patient." I backed toward the door. "Judith?" No answer from the hall speaker. Just a low electric hiss. The patient on the bed kept his eyes on me. Oliver's eyes, though I knew they weren't. "If you do it again," he said quietly, "at least admit why." The speaker clicked again. This time the voice wasn't Judith's. "Restrain the patient now." The command came through calm and male. And for one impossible second I couldn't tell if I was hearing the intercom or the mouth of the man in front of me. I hit the call button and stepped into the hall. Judith. She was already there, as if she'd been waiting just beyond the door. No rush in her posture, no alarm. She carried the restraint pouch in one hand. "He's escalating," she said. "He's sitting still." "He won't for long." "That's not his voice." "I know." The patient inside laughed once softly. I looked from Judith to the restraint kit. The leather cuffs made a familiar dry sound as she shifted them in her grip. My chest felt tight. "Don't make me do this because a speaker told you to." "No," she said. "I'm making you do it because if we don't follow the sequence, someone else pays for it." That didn't make sense. It wasn't meant to. It landed anyway. I wish I could tell you I refused. I didn't. We went in together. Judith took the left side, efficient as a surgeon. The patient didn't fight until my hand touched his shoulder. Then he surged up with shocking speed, not wild, not panicked, but deliberate, as if he'd been waiting for the contact. He kept speaking the whole time in Oliver's voice, breath warm against my cheek as we forced him back. "You used your knee," he said, "not hard, just enough." "Hold him," Judith snapped. We did. Wrist, wrist, ankle, ankle, chest. The straps closed one by one with their old mechanical sounds, buckles ringing softly, leather drawn tight, bed frame complaining beneath the shift of weight. The patient strained once against them, then went still. Too still. Judith stepped back first. "Observation only," she said. Then she left me in the room with him, and that was the last normal order I got all night. At first he only breathed hard through his nose, eyes open, chest rising against the band in quick, shallow pulls. I stood near the foot of the bed and watched his color. Counted respirations, checked capillary refill in fingers already cooling from the strain. Competence is a shelter until it isn't. I moved through the assessment points automatically, grateful for them, grateful for anything that didn't require me to think about the voice I'd just heard. Then his breathing changed. Not stopped. Changed. Shorter. Thinner. The inhale catching halfway down like there was a hand inside him deciding how much air he was allowed to keep. His throat worked. His ribs tugged against the restraint strap. A fine sheen of sweat had come out at his temples. "I'm going to loosen that," I said aloud, more to hear myself than him. His eyes found mine, and in his own voice, finally his own, raw with fear, he said, "Please." Rule 5. Do not remove restraints once applied, regardless of patient distress. Every piece of training I had shoved against that line at once. Distress after restraint meant circulation check, airway check, adjustment if safe. You didn't freeze because of a laminated superstition in a desk drawer. I reached for the chest buckle. My fingers stopped on the leather. I don't know if that was because of the rule, or because of the last time, or because some part of me wanted to prove I could follow instructions and get a different ending. That possibility sickens me now. I called toward the door. "Judith!" No answer. The speaker above the bed remained dark. The patient tried to pull in another breath. Failed. Tried again. I could hear the wet click in the back of his throat. Not fluid. Panic. The body beginning to spend itself too fast. I checked the monitor clipped to his finger. Pulse elevated. Oxygen drifting down. Not catastrophic yet. Still time. I put 2 fingers under the chest strap, testing space. Too tight. Not crushing, but tight enough that in full panic it would feel like a wall. "Stay with me," I said. His eyes were huge now. "Please. Rule 6. If a patient stops breathing, wait for confirmation before intervening." He wasn't there yet. Not technically. That's how I bought myself the next 10 seconds. Not technically. Still moving air, still conscious, still time. The monitor emitted one long, flat tone. I jerked my head toward it. The line on the screen went straight for a single second. No pulse trace, no oxygen reading. Just a clean, impossible flat line. Then it snapped back into normal rhythm as if nothing had happened. My scalp crawled. The patient made a strangled sound and turned his face toward me as far as the restraints allowed. "You waited last time too," he whispered. Not in his voice. I stumbled back hard enough to hit the cabinet behind me. The speaker clicked. Nothing. No instruction, no confirmation. Only the dead little opening of the line, the suggestion of speech withheld. I stood there with my hand on the restraint key in my pocket, every instinct screaming at me to release the chest strap, and did nothing. Because if this was a test, I didn't know who was setting it. Because if Judith was right and there was a sequence, breaking it might carry the harm somewhere else. And because Oliver's voice had reached through 5 buried years and laid a hand directly on the ugliest choice I'd ever made, and part of me had already started believing I deserved to be made to stand still. After maybe 20 seconds, maybe 40, the patient's breathing deepened on its own. Ragged at first, then fuller. His oxygen reading rose by degrees. Color returned to his mouth. His eyes slid shut, not from peace, just exhaustion. I was still standing in the same place when Judith came back. She took one look at the monitor and said, "Good." I stared at her. "Good? You didn't remove them. He couldn't breathe. He could. You didn't hear that?" She began writing in the observation chart at the foot of the bed with small, neat strokes. "Oh yeah, I heard enough. That monitor flatlined. For 1 second. That's not normal." "No," she said, "it isn't." I wanted to grab the pen out of her hand, shake her, demand the part of the explanation she was withholding. Instead, I looked down at the chart. In the comments field, before she'd written anything else, there was already a line in faded older ink from a previous page beneath the carbon backing. The pressure had transferred upward just enough to read if the light hit it right. "You waited last time, too." My stomach turned. Judith closed the chart before I could look longer. "Take 10 minutes, she said, "then do rounds." I didn't move. She met my eyes. "We're only at 12:20. It gets harder from here." She said it like weather, like an incoming tide, and I took my 10 minutes in the chart room because it was the only place in the unit where I could shut a door and pretend that mattered. The room was dry and overheated, paper dust in the air, old plastic binders giving off that faint warm smell of office equipment and age. Through the cinder block wall, I could still feel the waves striking the cliff beneath us. Every few blows, something in the shelving gave a tiny sympathetic rattle. I told myself I was looking for context. What I was really looking for was proof that there was a mechanism beneath the madness, a prank, a staff ritual grown malignant, a documented set of incidents I could map and understand. The overnight logs went back years, boxed by month, then by week. Judith kept them obsessively: restraint use, incident reports, observation notes, environmental outages. And I pulled the storm months first, hands moving faster every time I saw a date that stirred some recognition. The old intake years, the winters with coastal flooding, nights where the census was high and the staffing low. It didn't take long. Same time, over and over. 2:13 in the morning, circled in red or blue or pencil depending on who'd been on. Some nights had pages of detail leading up to it and almost nothing after. Other nights were blank from 2 o'clock until dawn, except for a single sentence written in the margin as if the writer hadn't trusted the official lines. Followed instruction. Patient stabilized. Or entered room against directive. Escalation spread to West Wing. Or just waited. I found one entry in Judith's hand from 8 years earlier that listed 3 patients by room number, and then crossed all 3 out so hard the paper had nearly torn. In the margin beside them, she'd written, "It only needed 1. My mouth went dry again. I kept reading. The strangest part wasn't the repetition. It was the omissions. Whole sections gone soft from erasure. Pages removed cleanly from rings. Notes that began in one hand and ended in another, as if shifts had changed mid-sentence. More than once I found the same phrase written in places it didn't belong, tucked into nursing comments, med reconciliation notes, even one dietary incident sheet. "You waited last time too." Not once or twice. Dozens. On one old restraint review, there was no clinical reason attached to the event, just that line and the initials JF beneath it. On another, unsigned, the sentence had been written so many times over itself that the paper had puckered. I turned a page and found my own handwriting. At least I thought it was mine at first. Same slant, same clipped capital letters. Same habit of pressing too hard on the downstroke. The date at the top put it 5 years back, the storm blackout night, though the official file on Oliver's death had never included this page. Patient became cyanotic during hold, then a gap, a line scratched through so viciously it was unreadable. Then beneath it, in that same hand, calmer this time, waited for confirmation. I sat there with the page between my fingers while the heat vent clicked on and blew dry air across my face. I had no memory of writing it. That doesn't mean I hadn't. Memory isn't a vault. It's a frightened employee deciding what gets filed and what gets burned. I flipped through the attached notes. The next page was missing, and so was the one after that. Then came the routine incident summary I did remember, the sanitized version that had survived review. Storm conditions, reduced visibility, patient acute agitation, unfortunate compression event during necessary restraint, accidental death with no evidence of intentional misconduct. No evidence. I stared at that phrase until the letters lost meaning. Then I heard Judith humming. Not far away, just outside the chart room door. The tune was soft and tuneless, almost under her breath. I slipped the log back into the file and opened the door an inch. The corridor lights seemed dimmer than they had an hour earlier. Wind hissed at the windows. The whole building had taken on that after midnight feeling where every surface seemed to wait. Judith stood halfway down the hall outside a room with the door open. A patient lay on the bed inside, eyes closed, not resisting, not even awake enough to focus. Judith was fastening the ankle restraint with gentle hands, smoothing the strap flat against the blanket the way you might smooth a sheet under a sleeping child. The patient gave a weak, confused murmur. She kept humming. I stepped out into the hall. "What are you doing?" She didn't startle. She never startled. "Preventing trouble," she said. "He isn't fighting. He doesn't need to be." I moved toward the doorway and saw the rest of the setup. Wrist restraints already applied, chest band ready. The patient's breath shallow but even, sedated or close to it. "Judith." She finished the buckle and rose. Up close I could see how tired her face really was. Not frightened, worn down by repetition. Like sea glass worn smooth by the same collision over and over again. "You remember less than I hoped," she said. That landed harder than accusation would have. "What are these rules actually for?" She looked past me, not at the clock on the far wall, but to the window where the storm had finally begun to throw rain hard enough to sound on glass. "Containment. Of what?" "Pattern. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters at 1 in the morning." The patient on the bed stirred. His fingers flexed against the cuff. Judith leaned in and fastened the chest strap with measured pressure. Not too tight. Expert. Practiced. Then she turned her face slightly toward the ceiling speaker and whispered, "Thank you." My skin went cold. Not survival. Cooperation. "You've been doing this on purpose," I said. "I've been keeping the count down. By restraining sedated patients and waiting for them to stop breathing." Her expression changed then, a small tightening around the mouth. "Don't flatter yourself, Eamon. You think this started with you because guilt always makes men feel central." The words hit, but not as hard as the next ones. "I covered for you," she said. "That night with Oliver, I signed that there were 3 staff in the room when there were only 2. I signed that the lighting failure made placement hard to assess. I signed that you followed protocol because if I'd written what I believed, you'd have lost your license, and Gull Harbor would have kept needing someone to do the same work under a different name." I couldn't breathe for a second. The hall seemed to tilt around me, not physically, just morally, as if the floor had finally admitted what it had always been built on. "Why?" I asked. Because by then I understood what the place wanted. And what is that? She looked at me at last. A person who can choose not to act and keep choosing it. The patient behind her let out a dry little exhale. Judith checked the strap, then stepped past me into the hall. I caught her wrist. You don't get to say this is bigger than me after you buried what happened. She glanced down at my hand until I let go. I buried nothing, she said. I archived it. The building did the rest. That was the last honest thing she said to me before 2 o'clock. The next 30 minutes moved like a tightening wire. By 1:30, the storm was fully on us. Rain hammered the outer shutters in hard, slanting bursts, and the floor vibrated more sharply with each wave strike. Not steady now, but jarring, as if the sea below had found a better angle to hit from. The saline smell was stronger everywhere, threading through the disinfectant until it seemed to live in the back of my nose. Patients who'd slept earlier were awake, not agitated in the ordinary sense, alert, listening. I made rounds with the logbook under my arm and the rule sheet folded in my pocket so tightly the laminate edge dug into my thigh. In room 2, a woman who hadn't spoken all evening watched the dark window and said in Oliver's voice, "You checked the monitor before you checked my mouth." In room 4, a man with advanced dementia turned his head as I passed and murmured, "You liked how fast it was, remember?" Then he blinked, confused, and asked where his brother had gone. Every time it happened, I tried to answer as if it were Oliver because the rule demanded it, because at that point I was obeying almost mechanically, because any break in the sequence felt like stepping off a path cut through deep water. "Stop. I'm listening. I remember." But that last one was a lie. I only remembered pieces. The entity, if that's what it was, understood that better than I did. It kept feeding them back one by one. At 1:47, the intercom above the station clicked on and said, "Check room 6." I went. Room 6 was empty. The bed had been stripped, window latched. No patient assigned there that night. The room held only radiator heat, bleach, and the damp mineral scent of storm water somewhere in the walls. I stood in the doorway with the hairs on my arms raised. Then the speaker in the room clicked too. Nothing. Just open line, waiting. I backed out and shut the door. At 1:52, the intercom at the station said, "Do not enter room 7. At 1:54, the hall speaker outside the medication room said, "Prepare room 7. Contradictions. Direct ones now. No ambiguity left. Written rules against spoken commands. Spoken commands against themselves. Betrayal made operational. Judith heard them both and gave no visible reaction. She was at the station writing on the overnight board. Posture easy, shoulders loose, as if the old system barking impossible orders was no stranger than a fax machine with a paper jam. "You said following the rules kept people alive," I told her. "It does." "Which rules?" She capped her pen. "The right ones. That's convenient." "No," she said. "It's the problem." At 1:58, all the patient call lights came on at once, not blinking, solid. The board lit red from end to end, every corridor washed in that muted alarm glow. A second later, from rooms on both wings, voices started, not shouting, speaking. Some low, some high, male and female, and old and young. All layered over each other in calm, overlapping phrases that turned the whole unit into one impossible conversation. I could hear my name from 3 directions at once. I could hear Oliver's voice inside other voices, through them, under them. "You used your knee. You never called respiratory. You said he was dramatizing. You waited. Last time, too." The words moved through the halls like water finding cracks. Doors rattled in their frames from the storm. The intercom clicked on, off, saying nothing for several long seconds, and that blankness was worse than any order. It felt like listening to something decide. Judith stood up. "It's starting," she said. I laughed then, just once, sharp and humorless, because what else was there to do with a sentence like that? "It's been starting all night." "No," she said, and for the first time there was strain in her voice. "This is the count." The clock over the station said 2 o'clock. Every patient voice in the building stopped at once. The silence that followed was so abrupt I heard the fluorescent ballast buzz in the ceiling and the faint wet squeak of my own hand tightening on the counter. Then the intercom above the station spoke in Oliver's voice. "Room 7 is ready." Judith's face emptied. She didn't look at me, didn't look at the clock. Just reached into the desk drawer, took out the restraint key ring, and placed it beside my hand. "I can't go in with you," she said. "Why?" "Because it isn't asking me." The West Hall lights dimmed further. Somewhere a patient began to laugh in short, breathless bursts, then gagged it down. I looked at the key ring. "If I refuse," she answered without hesitation, "then it chooses blind. And if I go, it chooses you." Those should not have felt like the same answer. I heard a door unlatch down the hall. Not electronically, not the usual buzz and release. A slow mechanical click, then the soft scrape of hinges opening under their own weight. Room 7. I took the keys because my hand moved before my mind did. The metal was warm. As I started down the corridor, the intercom clicked again behind me and said nothing at all. That silence followed me the whole way. Room 7 had been unused on paper for months. Storage, supposedly, after a plumbing leak warped the floor baseboards and left a patch of salt bloom climbing the lower wall. I knew that because I'd checked the census earlier. I also knew, with a different and older part of my mind, that Room 7 had once been an overflow restraint room back when intake still ran on storm nights. When I reached the open doorway, I smelled wet canvas. For a second, my body stopped while the rest of me kept moving. That smell had no place in the present. Neither did the battery acid tang under it. Neither did the specific cold of a room where a window seal is failing and storm air is pushing through in a thread you can feel against the sweat at the base of your neck. The lights inside were low. Not dark, but wrong, as if the room were lit by weaker electricity than the hall outside. The speaker in the ceiling hummed softly. The bed sat in the middle of the floor, and on it lay Oliver Dane Kitteridge. Not as a ghost, not transparent, not some half-seen shape in a corner. A full human body in hospital scrubs, wrists fastened high, ankles strapped, chest band angled just slightly off-center the way I'd once told myself was close enough under pressure. His hair was damp against his forehead. His face looked younger than the one in memory because the dead don't age and the guilty do. I didn't go in right away. My hand stayed on the doorframe. Salt had bloomed through the paint there, rough under my palm like dried sugar. Oliver turned his head toward me, the straps creaked. "Amen," he said, and this time it was only his voice. No layering, no mimicry, just Oliver. Behind me, somewhere far down the corridor, I heard patients begin speaking again softly all at once. Not words I could make out, just the fact of many mouths moving. The intercom over Room 7 clicked. "Wait for confirmation," it said. Oliver's eyes widened. "No." I stepped into the room. The floor was colder here, colder than it should have been. The wave strikes below came through the tile in hollow impacts. I could hear his breathing already, quick and shallow, and with each inhale the chest strap pulled. "It wasn't like this," I said, though I don't know if I meant the room or the memory. Oliver watched me with an exhaustion that felt older than anger. "It was enough like this." I moved to the side of the bed, the restraint key ring pressed hard into my palm. One turn and the chest strap would loosen. Another and the wrist cuff. My whole body leaned toward action. The speaker crackled. "If you intervene before confirmation," it said, "the West Wing doors release. As if in answer, alarms chirped faintly beyond the room. Not full emergency alarms. Door integrity alerts. I looked up through the doorway toward the corridor and saw the West Wing status panel at the station flicker from red to amber, then back. Oliver heard it too. It's lying. Maybe. It lied before. You were there? He gave me a look I still haven't found words for. Not accusation, not mercy. Recognition of the worst thing about me. I was under you, he said. The sentence nearly put me on my knees. I remembered then. Not everything. Enough. The blackout. The emergency torch clamped between my teeth. Oliver, half sedated, half furious, demanding to be released. Then demanding to be held because he said his skin wouldn't stay on right unless somebody held him down. Me deciding not to call for another team because it would mean another incident packet, another physician wake up, another hour lost to forms and review. Judith elsewhere in the ward. Me alone with a patient I'd decided I understood. My knee between his shoulder blades, light pressure at first. Then a little more. Then the exact moment he said very clearly, I can't get air, and I answered, you can, Oliver, stop performing. That was the choice. Not the death, not the report after, not the lie, that sentence, that small contempt. Convenience over care packed into 6 words. My vision blurred, I wiped at my eyes angrily with the heel of my hand and forced myself back into the room as it existed now. Oliver on the bed, in storm at the windows. Intercom waiting to see what kind of man repetition had made of me. His breathing hitched. Amen, he said, and for the first time there was fear in it. Real fear. Don't let it make you look away again, the speaker answered immediately. Wait. I turned toward the doorway. Judith. She appeared there almost at once, as if she'd been standing just out of sight. The corridor light behind her haloed the edges of her scrub top. She still didn't look at the clock on the wall outside. Not once. What happens if I cut him loose? Her face tightened. Maybe this room, maybe all of them. Some nights it spreads when challenged. Some nights? We've never had the same night twice. Oliver made a choking sound. I looked back. His chest rose, stopped halfway, trembled. The speaker said, wait. Oliver said, you please. Judith said very quietly, if you break sequence now, you may buy him seconds and cost everyone else the night. Everyone else meant sedated patients, frightened patients, people behind thin locked doors with old hardware and thinner staffing. People who'd never chosen any of this. And on the bed was the one person I had already failed once, in the one shape of failure the building understood best. There wasn't a right answer in that room. I need that understood. People like to imagine guilt gives clarity. It doesn't. It gives gravity. It drags every choice toward the scene of the first mistake and makes every resemblance feel like destiny. I moved to the chest strap and set the key against the lock. The West Wing panel outside chirped again. Amber. Red. Amber. Judith whispered, Amen. Not a warning, a plea, and that was what made it worse. She wasn't protecting the entity, not simply. She was protecting the arithmetic she had built around it. One restraint, one room, one death maybe, instead of open doors and a whole ward in chaos. She had made herself the willing part because willingness let her call it stewardship, and some part of me understood her. That was the betrayal that mattered. Oliver's face had gone pale. Sweat stood out on his upper lip. He tried to suck in air and couldn't quite complete it. The bed frame trembled under the effort. If I wait, I said, not sure whether I was speaking to Oliver, Judith, or the room. How do I know it's not just teaching me to do it again? The speaker answered. You don't. It wasn't Oliver's voice this time. It was mine. My hand jerked so badly the key scraped the lock and fell to the floor. Nobody moved for it. The waves hit below us hard enough to shatter the wall. Somewhere in the ward, several patients cried out together, not in pain, in recognition. The clock outside the room turned to 2:13, and I waited. I wish there were nobility in the way I did it. There wasn't. I didn't stand straighter. I didn't make some heroic sacrifice for the many. I stood there shaking, hands empty at my sides, while Oliver fought the chest strap one breath at a time, and Judith stayed in the doorway like a witness who had long ago mistaken endurance for wisdom. The first thing that changed was the sound. His breathing had been ragged, wet with panic, the body's small, desperate labor. Then it thinned. The room took more of the noise back. Wind at the seal, speaker hum, distant surf under the floor. Oliver's breath spaced farther apart until I could hear the pause between them grow and begin to feel like an object in the room with us. He kept his eyes on me. That was the worst part. Not accusation, not even hatred. He watched me the way a patient watches a nurse who has already made the decision and is waiting for the body to catch up to it. I took one step toward the bed. The speaker clicked. No words. Just that open line, alive and listening. I stopped. Judith closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Still, she didn't look at the clock. Maybe because she never needed confirmation from clocks anymore. Maybe because by then time belonged to the building more than it did to us. Oliver tried once more. His chest lifted barely an inch, fell, did not rise again. I counted before I knew I was doing it. 1, 2, 3, 4. The old training, automatic and useless. At 6 seconds, his mouth parted. At 10, the speaker went silent, not clicked off. Silent in a deeper way, as if the current had been withdrawn from it, as if whatever had been inhabiting the wires had gotten what it came for and stepped back. At 15 seconds, the entire unit went quiet. No voices from the halls, no call lights, no door alerts. Even the fluorescent buzz seemed to thin. The storm outside was already moving off east, the rain less violent, the wave impacts below broader now, further apart. It sounded less like battering and more like aftermath. I moved then. Too late. I unlocked the chest strap first, then the wrists. Hands clumsy, lungs burning as if I'd been the one held down. Oliver's skin was warm. His neck gave nothing useful under my fingers. I checked airway. He'd started to lower the bed, reached for the call button, the crash sequence already lining itself up in my head from pure professional habit. Judith said, "Don't." I turned on her with such force I barely recognized my own voice. "Don't tell me that now." But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the bed. I looked too. The body on it wasn't Oliver anymore. It was the patient from observation 3. Same broad shoulders, same bruised knuckles, mouth slightly open, face gray with the first stillness of death. The restraints hung loose where I'd released them. The room around us had gone fully ordinary. No wrong lighting. No wet canvas smell, no battery tang, just disinfectant, salt, radiator heat. I staggered back so hard my heel struck the dropped key and sent it skittering under the bed. Judith crossed herself, not out of religion, out of reflex older than reason. Then she seemed to realize what she'd done and pressed her hand flat against her chest instead. "Who was in this room?" I asked. She answered after too long a pause. "No one assigned." "Don't." "I don't know," she said, and for the first time all night I believed her. We stood there while the building held its breath around us. Then, very softly from somewhere above the ceiling, I heard Judith's humming. Not beside me, in the intercom wiring. She heard it too. I saw it in her face. Her eyes lifted to the speaker. Her mouth parted slightly, not in fear exactly, more in awful recognition. "Jude," I said. She backed into the corridor without taking her eyes off the ceiling. It doesn't need me now. Then she turned and walked away. Not ran. Walked. By the time I followed her into the hall, she was gone. When we searched the unit at dawn, or I did. I say we out of habit, but by then there was only me and the newer agency orderly who came in after the roads reopened, stamping seawater off his boots in the vestibule and apologizing for the delay. The patients were all alive, sedated or sleeping or blank-eyed in chairs, but alive. No West Wing breach, no mass escalation, one death to document, though not in any way that made the paperwork sane. Judith was nowhere in the building, no sign of forced exit. Her coat still on the hook, mug at the station with coffee cold in the bottom. Charting half finished in her neat hand until the final line, where the pen had pressed hard enough to score the page without leaving ink. I took report from nobody and gave report to a man who kept glancing at the windows because he'd clearly already decided this place wasn't paying enough. The storm had passed. Not fully clear, but the violent part of it had moved on. The ocean below still hit the cliffs, only slower now, like a giant thing settling. The unit smelled cleaner after a storm, if that makes sense. Not better. Just stripped. Saltier. As if the wind had scoured away whatever softness ordinary air leaves behind. I sat at the nurse's station with the overnight logbook open in front of me. My hands were steady. That was new. I wrote the notes the way Judith always had, concise and exact. Time of event, patient response, environmental conditions. I didn't know where to place the truth, so I used the old grammar of institutions and let it reduce everything into sequence and observation. At one point, I realized I hadn't looked at a clock in over an hour. That was new, too. The agency orderly, young, tired, cheeks red from the cold, finished signing his temporary access form and came over to the station. Anything I need to know before day shift gets here? The question should have broken something in me. It should have made me tell him to leave, to quit, to burn the laminated sheet in the drawer and never work another coastal overnight for anyone. Instead, I opened the middle drawer. The rule sheet was there, dry and flat and waiting, edges worn soft by years of hands. I slid it across the desk to him. He frowned. "What's this?" My mouth moved before I had to think about the words. "Just follow these exactly," I said, and he gave a nervous little laugh, the same one I had the night before, and unfolded the page. The speaker above us clicked once. Outside, the wind worried at the window seals with that thin, patient hiss. I kept writing. By then, I wrote the next instruction down before it finished saying it.